Hello, good people. It is great to be back with you and continue the discussion of whether distributism can answer Game B's questions. Now, what I want to do today is talk about distributism in the light of a couple of conceptions of justice. The first one is commutative justice. Commutative justice is based on an equality of exchange, and is understood within an arena of freedom, free exchange, free market. So, for example, if someone is selling a loaf of bread for $5 and someone wants to buy the bread for $5, if the man who has the loaf of bread wants the $5 more than the loaf of bread, and the man who has the $5 wants the loaf of bread more than the $5, and they do an exchange and they are both happy with the exchange, then we say that that exchange is an example of commutative justice. Now, this is assuming that there aren't any strange distortions in the market, like, for example, that the man who is selling the bread has not gone around surreptitiously and attempted to damage through lies the reputation of the other bakers in town, or has not done some other nefarious thing to distort the market. Then, as long as that the market is free and people are freely making their exchanges and are happy with them, then we say that that is an instance of commutative justice. Now, in an economy, there is another kind of justice, and that is distributive justice. So let's see if we can illustrate this. Let's say that there is an apple pie for sale, okay? And what went into the apple pie? Well, there is a man who has an orchard and he sells apples. Then there is a farmer who owns a wheat field and some pigs. Now, the farmer who owns the wheat field takes his wheat to a miller to be ground into flour, and he takes his pigs to a butcher. The person who is making the apple pie has to purchase apples from the apple orchard, and lard from the butcher, and flour from the miller. Now, at the end result, when there is a pie and the pie is sold, there should be a distribution of the sale price of the pie to all of the people who contributed to its production. Usually, this is done through commutative justice. So the baker who's baking the pie would buy the apples according to commutative justice. He would purchase the flour and the lard according to commutative justice, and the miller would get the wheat from the farmer according to commutative justice, and the butcher would get the pigs from the farmer according to commutative justice. And so all of these actions of commutative justice along the chain would result in proper distributive justice. So through the commutative justice, the price of the pie ends up being shared among all of the people who contributed to its production. Now, how could this possibly be distorted? Well, let's say that the apple orchard and the farm and the mill and the butcher shop and the bakery are all on a plantation. And the plantation is a slave plantation, and so all of the workers who contributed to this final production of the pie that's going to be sold off of the plantation for a profit are all slaves, and they get none of the price. None of the price is passed on to them at all. So we would recognize pretty quickly that that is a distortion of distributive justice. Now, of course, it's a distortion of justice in many other ways if there's slavery, but we just focus here on the fact that everyone who contributes to the end result of that thing that is sold deserves some share in that income that comes from the sale of that thing. And so that is what we mean by distributive justice. Well, what if instead of a plantation, it's a corporation? And let's say it's a corporation that owns all the land, and it owns the butcher shop, and it owns the mill, and it owns the farmland, it owns the bakery. And so at the end, and when the pies are produced, the corporation sells them for a profit. Now, how would we know whether everyone in the supply chain of this was receiving a proper compensation according to distributive justice. It would be whether the percentage of the profit that each of them received from the final sale was equivalent to, or reasonably equivalent to, their participation in the final product. However, if there are exceeding or excessive profits at the top, where a large amount of the profit of the sale of the things goes to those who do not participate at all in the actual labor of the making of the things, then we see that we have a violation of distributive justice. And so in the corporate system, there are large-scale violations of distributive justice. And this is exactly what Brett Weinstein and Eric Weinstein keep talking about when they speak about the laboring classes being denied a share of the profits that their own labor has produced in the United States over the past about 40 years. Now, when industrialization began and there were all this exploitation of the workers, there was an attempt to fix this problem of distributed justice among the workers by unionizing them and having them collectively bargain. The whole point of the collective bargaining was to try to take some of those profits that the corporations were making and distribute them by increasing wages and increasing benefits, distribute them to the working classes. The destruction of the unions has resulted in a distortion now in the market, where we see that the laboring classes in the United States have been denied their share of the distribution of the profits that their own labor has created. Now, I want to make it clear that we're not talking here about some idea that the labor itself is what determines the value of the item. It doesn't. The value is determined by the market, by the end product itself. Now, for example, let's say that I purchase some fabric and I decide to make some shirts and sell them. And I spend, let's say I spend 3 hours making a shirt, and I decide, well, I want to make $15 an hour for my labor, and the particular fabric costs $5 for each shirt. So then I decide that I'm going to have to sell each one for $50. Well, just the fact that I put in the labor to make those things is not going to be the determining factor of whether they're worth $50 or not. Whether they're worth that is whether someone is willing to pay that amount of money for them, and it's worth that to them. So the market determines the value at the end. It's not as though, I'm not saying here what some people, I think from Marxist persuasion would say, that it's the labor itself that determines the value. No, it's the end product that determines the value. The fact is that the end products that the American laboring classes created all through the 20th century were very highly valued, and they were sold for incredible profits. And starting at the middle of the 20th century toward the end, less and less of that profit actually flowed, particularly since the 1970s, flowed to those laboring classes. And most of it flowed to elites at the top who profited off of the labor of others. Every time that someone profits off the labor of others, in other words, anytime anyone receives money within an economy and they have not produced anything, then that money that they receive comes off of the what is justly due to those who are producing. Now, this, of course, doesn't mean that we can't have other occupations within our society other than those that are actually productive. And by productive, I'm talking about those that actually take things, raw materials from the ground, or grow things from the ground, and then add value to them. Obviously, we have to have other kinds of, we have to have services, for example, but they have to be in service to the productive part of the economy. If they're not, if they're purely extractive from the productive part of the economy, then that is a case of a distortion of, or a crime against distributive justice. So then, is there any way to actually run a business or run a corporation according to distributive justice? Can this actually be done within our capitalist society? Well, yes, it can, and it is being done all of the time. There are a number of ways to make sure that the amount of profit that comes from the production of something is justly distributed to those who have contributed their labor. This requires that there not be a kind of adversarial stance between labor and ownership. Rather, it has to be a sense of solidarity and cooperation between labor and ownership, not an exploitative relationship. So how could this be done? Well, let's say that someone is going to start a company to manufacture something, and he has to come up with the capital to start a factory and to do all of the pre-planning that's involved in setting up a business plan, etc. And then how is he going to figure out whether he can sell his product at a profit? He's going to have to consider in his business plan, he's going to have to consider labor as a cost to begin with in order to figure out whether he can sell his product at a profit. And it's perfectly reasonable when making this kind of plan to calculate the business according to man hours, because that is how he can tell whether he can sell his product at a profit. Obviously, if what he is going to pay his labor is greater than the amount that he can get for the product at the end, there's no way that he can make any money, and it would not be a viable business. So it's not as though distributism doesn't recognize that labor is a cost of production. However, once the business is up and running and the factory is in production, it isn't a case that the labor then has to be considered to be a cost of production. The way it would work is this. You have certain costs of the business that have to come off the top with anything that comes into the business, right? You have the servicing of any loans that were established at the beginning to get the factory started. You may have a mortgage on the property. You have to set aside a certain amount of money for capital improvements. You have to set aside a certain amount of money to protect the business in case of the exigencies of the market. You have to, the owner can justly pay himself a decent amount of money for his investment, for his time and his effort and his ingenuity that he has put into creating the product. However, after a reasonable amount is taken off of the top for him and for all of the business expenses, then there's the profit. In other words, you haven't calculated right now, you haven't taken the labor as part of the expenses at this point. So you look at the profit then, and then you see how you can distribute that profit among the labor. And this requires this kind of judgment, and this is why it is called justice. Justice requires judgment. How would it be just to distribute the profits then among everyone whose labor went into the production of this particular product? That would be proportionally. So you could say, this particular person put in 5% of the work to making this product that deserves 5% of this profit, etc. And you do that throughout the entire organization and throughout all of the people who are working. So these people are not really employees in the traditional sense that we consider someone to be an employee under capitalism. Under distributism, rather, they are free agents who are contracting their labor for a percentage of the profit. That means that they see a direct relationship between the labor that they put in and the profit that is made by the company. Think about what a different relationship that is with the owner of the company. Right now, the way that it works in many corporations is sabotage and pilfering from the corporation is very rampant among the employees because they don't see themselves as actually contributing to the profit. They don't see the profit as coming back to them, so they don't care. They have a very adversarial attitude with their employer, and therefore they act as though they are enemies of the corporation that they are actually themselves working for in many cases. So that is a very destructive relationship, and it is not a productive relationship. You can have a much more productive relationship with labor if the laborers see a direct relationship between what they do, how they work, with profit, and they see that profit is returned to them. Another way to do this is through what are called employee stock options. I mentioned these before. Employee stock options were developed by Catholic distributists as a way to properly distribute profits of a business to the employees. But like I said, with the other arrangement, you don't actually have to have traditional employees. You may wonder, are any businesses actually running according to these principles? And yes, they are. There are worker-owned cooperatives, and distributists run businesses all over the world. One of the most famous that is operated according to distributist principles is the Mondragon Corporation and the Mondragon family of businesses in the Basque country of Spain. This was started in, I think it was the 1930s, by a Catholic priest who wanted the area to benefit from industrialization, but without the kind of exploitation of workers that industrialization was producing in so many parts of the world. So he started this particular cooperative enterprises. And this particular area of Spain, the Basque Country, where the Mondragon Corporation is the most productive area of Spain. Very, very profitable enterprises. And you can look them up online and see, you know, all the different enterprises that they have. They have banks, they have schools, they have all kinds of industrial enterprises going on. And they run according to distributist principles. Now, of course, it helps that the Basque people are very independent-minded. And in fact, they're so independent-minded that they would actually like to be a separate country from Spain. They have a strong sense of enterprise and solidarity with one another that has made them very productive and entrepreneurial people. But that's how Americans used to be. We used to be a productive and entrepreneurial people, and we used to have a strong sense of solidarity with one another. And until we became largely a proletariat employee or laboring class, we had that same kind of enterprising spirit that you see that is running the Mondragon Corporation. But there are still in the United States today, there are businesses that are run according to these principles. Now, I mentioned before in my videos, Joel Salatin, who runs Polyface Farms in Virginia. And Joel Salatin runs his business according to distributist principles. He doesn't call it distributism. He calls it stacking fiefdoms. And he says he gives all of the people who work with him their own fiefdom. And he says everybody needs their own fiefdom. And so he has an arrangement with them where they use, rather than employee contracts, they use memoranda of understanding. And I'll put a link in the description to Joel Salatin giving a talk where he explains his management philosophy and how he runs his business, and how he does not want employees at all. And he doesn't want to have the kind of relationship with the people that work with him that is traditional between employees and employers. So it is good to have examples of this to show that companies and enterprises run by distributist principles can work, they can be profitable, and they can be competitive within the capitalist environment. Now, nowhere is this more needed than in the agricultural sector, which Joel Salatin is working in, because everyone now recognizes that we need to have a distributed food system because we are too vulnerable with a concentrated centralized food system. And a distributed food system then permits many people to be involved in production and to have their own means of production, to put their own land into production, and also to produce many value-added products at a local level. Now, this was pointed out by Benedict XVI. Pope Benedict XVI on November 14th, 2010, said this: "The process of industrialization has often overshadowed the agricultural sector, which, while also drawing benefit from modern technologies, has nevertheless lost importance with notable consequences even at the cultural level. I believe this is the moment for the reevaluation of agriculture, not in a nostalgic sense, but as an indispensable resource for the future." Agriculture is an indispensable resource because it is agriculture that lies at the base of any economy. Right now, our food system is broken. The health of our population is broken. The relationships between people are broken. And all of this is the result of very extractive industrial processes attempted to be used in agriculture. But agriculture cannot be run according to these extractive industrial processes. It has to be distributed, and it has to be run according to distributist principles, not industrial principles. This is because agriculture especially has to be an enterprise for the common good. This is the consistent message of Catholic social teaching, and it is the foundation of a just society. Over 100 years ago in Rerum Novarum, Pope Leo XIII said, "Every man has by nature the right to possess property as his own. It must be within his right to possess things not merely for temporary and momentary use as other living things do, but to have and hold them in permanent possession. Hence, man should not only possess the fruits of the earth, but also the very soil, inasmuch as from the produce of the earth he has to lay by provision for the future. Private ownership is in accordance with the law of nature. When man thus turns the activity of his mind and the strength of his body toward procuring the fruits of nature, by such act he makes his own that portion of nature's field which he cultivates, and it cannot but be just that he should possess that portion as his very own and have a right to hold it without anyone be justified in violating that right. As effects follow their cause, so it is just and right that the results of labor should belong to those who have bestowed their labor." That's the distributive justice that I was talking about. It applies in agriculture. It applies in industry. In his message on World Food Day, 2006, Benedict XVI said, "The order of creation demands that priority be given to those human activities that do not cause irreversible damage to nature, but which instead are woven into the social, cultural, and religious fabric of the different communities. In this way, a sober balance is achieved between consumption and the sustainability of resources. The rural family needs to regain its rightful place at the heart of the social order." Let me say that again. The rural family needs to regain its rightful place at the heart of the social order. So at the heart of the social order, at the center of Catholic social teaching, is the rural family. That is the family on productive land, family owning its own productive property. That is to be the centerpiece of Catholic social teaching. You never hear this. I will tell you right now, all the many hours that I have spent listening to lectures about Catholic social teaching never starts with the rural family. But that is what it starts with in the teaching of the church, is the teaching of Pope Benedict XVI. He goes on to say that the moral principles and values which govern it, that is, which govern the rural family or the family on land, belong to the heritage of humanity and must take priority over legislation. That means the moral principles and values that govern the rural family, they are concerned with individual conduct, relations between husband and wife and between generations, and the sense of family solidarity. Investment in the agricultural sector has to allow the family to assume its proper place and function, avoiding the damaging consequences of hedonism and materialism that can place marriage and family life at risk. So, in Catholic social teaching, there is a centerpiece, and that is the family itself on land, owning productive property. Now, in an industrialized society, the ownership of productive property can also include some portion of a larger productive enterprise, such as a factory or a large business. As long as we put the family at the center and there is an intention to distributive justice, so that workers are able to also be owners of their own productive property, or at the very least be guaranteed that the profits of their productive labor will come back to them in some way, and not be concentrated in the hands of a few who are exploiting them, then we have a just society that operates according to the principles of both commutative justice and distributive justice. This is where the Catholic principles of subsidiarity and solidarity shine, because in solidarity, remember, all the different classes, from the wealthy to the poor, are joined together in a common project of society. And subsidiarity says that we value the lower levels, that the higher levels have to serve the lower, and they justify their existence by the service that they're giving to the lower levels. Ultimately, all of the levels have to serve the production at the bottom, because it is the basis of the society. Now, this means that there's no such thing as a service economy. We have been fed such a load of crock over the past 30 years or so, the Americans saying, oh, we can have a service economy and everybody can just have these wonderful jobs where they sit in offices and push paper around or push buttons on a computer all day long. And we don't have to sweat, and we don't have to work in hard jobs and, laboring jobs and, steel mills and glass factories and all of that stuff. We'll have a service economy. No, there is no such thing as an economy that is based upon service. The purpose of service is to serve production, actual making things. Otherwise, you're not going to have an economy at all. What you will do is end up reducing your population to a bunch of proletariat slaves, and they'll fall very rapidly from these cushy service jobs into working for almost nothing, driving Uber cars or delivering food from door to door and that sort of thing, with no benefits, none of the benefits that the unions had worked so hard to get their employees through the mid-20th century. That stuff has all gone out the window. So how is it that we can reclaim a distributed economy? Do we have any resources that we can put into having a distributed economy? Well, that's what I want to talk about next time, and talk about how we might begin to achieve a distributed economy even in the midst of the horrible economic conditions that have been visited upon us by this coronavirus pandemic. So until we're together again, treat yourself as though you are someone you are responsible for helping, because you are responsible. So am I, and together we are making the world. Bye for now. Thanks so much for watching.